Okay, good morning and welcome to the webinar today. My name is Carrie Berger and I'm the coordinator for the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. For those of you not familiar with the consortium, we are one of 15 fire science exchange networks that are funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. So part of our mission is to disseminate regionally relevant information to our stakeholders in both Oregon and Washington. We try to do this by offering a diversity of opportunities for people to participate in, and hosting webinars is just one way we accomplish that. To learn more about the consortium or to sign up for our monthly newsletter, visit our webpage at northwestfirescience.org. To avoid any noise interference, I have muted your audio, so if you have a question, please type it into the chat box. Also, I will be recording the webinar and will archive it on our website and YouTube channel. You can find both those links on our website, which I've provided in the chat window for you. So today, it's going to be great. We have two speakers. I'd like to welcome both Georgia Fredaluce and Tony Marks Block. Both Georgia and Tony are Graduate Research Innovation Grant recipients. These grants are made possible to the graduate researchers through funding from the Joint Fire Science Program. So I'll introduce both. Georgia Fredaluce is an ethno-ecologist and population biologist who investigates the relationship between people and plants. Her PhD work at the University of Hawaii at Manoa focuses on beargrass, which is a perennial forest understory herb in the Pacific Northwest. And we also have for you today Tony Marks Block is a PhD candidate at Stanford University, and he collaborates with Yurok and Karuk tribal members in the Klamath Mountains of Northwest California on prescribed fire and indigenous resource management. So with great pleasure, whenever you're ready, Georgia, we'd love to hear from you.
Okay, thank you, Carrie, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm just going to share my screen so we can take a look at the PowerPoint. Okay, so today I'm going to share some preliminary results from my PhD dissertation, and I just included a picture of myself since you won't be able to see me during the webinar, and this is at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And I have looked for ways to combine my interest in social justice with my interest in botany, and my longer-term goals are to do community-based work that would contribute to the tribal community well-being in my home state of Oregon, and also educate me about the issues surrounding plants of cultural significance as they relate to tribal members and indigenous peoples. So this is a longer-term goal for me, and something I wasn't fully able to accomplish in my PhD. But with this work, I'm taking a perspective of biocultural conservation, which means I'm interested in this interdependent, interlinked nature of nature and culture, or people and plants. You think about valuing local and traditional ecological knowledge and thinking of this as a knowledge, practice, belief complex. So these different components not being able to be separated, but being intertwined. And I have a few images here, one of a woman gathering palm leaves in India for brooms, another of a young man in Oregon City who's gathering a lamprey eel, and a quote from a late elder about that lamprey eel, which is one of the first foods that offered itself to people to take care of them. Spiritually, he is one of us, our brother who took care of us. So this sort of biocultural, these biocultural connections are incredibly valuable. And it's important that we work to conserve them and to promote their resilience. And one of the factors that affects those biocultural relationships is the availability of the plants in the environment. And major drivers of these plants and their plant populations include fire, climate change, as well as harvest. And when we think about where the gaps are in the knowledge from the perspective of plant demography, there's a need to understand better how multiple drivers, so these fire, climate change, and harvest, not only act individually, but how do they act together, and how might they interact to influence plant populations. And when we're talking about plants of cultural significance, so those that are utilized for food, for medicine, for ceremony, for other purposes, by local and indigenous peoples. When we're talking about those kind of plants, they tend to be managed by fire, and therefore they're going to be disproportionately affected by fire exclusion or fire suppression policies. And then further, it's not only the plant's abundance, but it's also the qualities. So the size, the shape, the chemical content, all these factors that are important when we think about the access and the availability to plants for biocultural conservation. So in order to address some of these gaps and to advance my understanding of biocultural relationships in my home area, I designed a case study around beargrass, Xerophyllum tenax, which is in the Melambiaceae family. It's an understory forest herb. It's monocarpic, which means when it flowers, it dies. It occurs across the range shown there in the left. And it has important ecological roles. For example, it provides food and materials from animals, from insects, deer, elk, up to grizzly bears. It also has important cultural roles and in the making of regalia and basketry. And basketry is cultural cornerstone to tribal members across the region where it occurs. And so Native peoples over millennia have managed beargrass through the use of fire and harvest. And typically, beargrass, after it's gathered, and that could be by removing a small number of leaves over a small portion of plants in a population, that bundle would be dried for around a year. The light-colored leaves, it dries to a creamy white, and those are used in various styles of weaving. For example, you see here the lighter color on the basket is the beargrass. So what are some of the concerns and some of the management opportunities? Fire suppression, meaning the state and federal policies enacted which putting out wildfires, but also limiting the use of cultural fire or Native American fire, which was traditionally more of that light surface fire, more frequent, especially in these subalpine areas that I'm going to focus on today. Climate change, the areas where I'm working are predicted to become drier. We don't know how that might affect beargrass. In terms of timber harvest, it has not been shown to recover well from logging. However, canopy openness is known to benefit, for example, in increasing the flowering. Commercial harvest in the lower right, you can see beargrass that was harvested by permit on Mount Hood National Forest near one of my sites. And this is for the floral greens industry. And this commercial harvest has not been studied directly as to its impacts, but it's known to limit the access, to limit the availability for cultural use. So access is a major issue for beargrass, not just in terms of the plants being available, but also in terms of the permitting processes being clear and roads being open for gatherers to access the plants. And further, the quality is typically reported to be declining across its range. The quality of leaves needed for weaving typically are reported to be declining in conjunction with fire suppression and other factors. And then in some regions, there's concern about youth engagement, or there's concern about the number of weavers. In certain communities, that is a concern that's expressed. So my overall project goal was to support the biocultural conservation of beargrass through investigation of tribal community knowledge and recommendations, and then also an ecological study of the drivers of plant quality and persistence in today's fire and climate context. Because, of course, what we see today for our forests is very different than what occurred 200 or more years ago. So we have to think a little bit differently in terms of adapting traditional knowledge towards the current context. And I'll talk mostly on the ecological study today. So just a little bit more on Native American fire management for beargrass. So in the subalpine, beargrass tends to co-occur with huckleberry, so you can think of the management somewhat overlapping. This was, again, a light surface fire, more frequent, in some areas every 3 years, other areas maybe longer, but these frequent low-severity fires. And this was performed by a knowledge of specialists. Much of this knowledge, people still have knowledge about burning fires, but some of it has also been lost. So fire and leaf quality. Most weavers appreciate leaves from recently burned beargrass, maybe 1 to 3 years. Studies have shown that burning in some areas leads to thinner leaves with less sclerified tissue, so this means the leaf is going to be more flexible, it's going to be stronger, right? Same thing that weavers will tell you. So fewer larger diameter trees, less downwood, and particular leaf colors, those are associated with the areas that have been considered by some to be good gathering areas, kind of the forest conditions you might look for. So how is beargrass utilized for weaving and in regalia? Here are a couple of examples. The upper left is a skirt, a dance skirt, and you can see the bare grass braids, and those need a certain taper of leaf. To the upper right, we have a huckleberry basket. You can see bare grass. Here you want more consistent width, and you can see natural dyes applied to the bare grass. To the lower right here, we have the wrapped twined and the basket cap also that require a thin, very pliable leaf that can be wrapped very tightly. So it's different qualities you need for different types of weaving, and you might even be looking for leaves on different parts of the plant, for example. So in terms of ecological drivers of persistence and quality, in this study, the factors that I explored included fire severity, harvest, canopy cover, and soil moisture. Soil moisture is one way we can look at the effects of climate change, and fire severity is a way to investigate what impacts of fire suppression may be on the plant population. And then we looked at the impact on population growth and leaf qualities. So my research questions for the ecological study are: what are the effects of fire severity, harvest, canopy, soil moisture, and their interactions on the growth, survival, reproduction, and long-term dynamics of bare grass? So on its life cycle and on what's going to happen to it in the long term. And then also, what are the impacts of these effects on the leaf qualities that might be important for weaving? For the overall dissertation, I have a population dynamic study. I did a harvest experiment. That was the fieldwork components. I also measured leaf quality on the leaves that were harvested, and then spent time with weavers, learned to weave, attended gatherings, and performed some formal interviews with a select few expert weavers. My study sites for the ecological study are on the Mount Hood National Forest, Clackamas Ranger District. The green here shows the National Forest land. And those are my 3 sites, which are all wildfires that occurred in 2014 in the subalpine zone. At each of these sites, I established 1 plot in high severity, 1 plot low severity, and 1 outside the fire in unburned area, using a stratified random approach. I took the standard demographic measurements, and then I also measured soil moisture early and late season with the soil moisture probe, and canopy openness, again, to see how much light the plant gets. That was with the hemispheric camera lens. I used this data collected over 3 years on the same tagged plants to create regression models. And those regression models told us what was happening in each part of the life cycle of the plant. I combined those into what's called an IPM, or integral projection model. And that's a way for us to compare across different conditions, in this case, different fire severities, how these populations would be projected to be doing in the long term. So I'm going to begin with my results now. And I'm going to start with a summary over the life cycle, and then I'll talk about the leaf qualities, and then after that, I'll go ahead and conclude with the conclusion. So here's bare grass life cycle. In the center, we see adults. As we move, I wonder if I can point, I guess not. Okay. As we move to the right, this is a picture of clonal reproduction. The plants vegetatively or clonally reproduce. So this arrow would represent that clonal reproduction, and then the clones can grow back into adults. Also, plants that flower, in my observations, always also clonally or vegetatively reproduce. And those flowers produce seedlings, which then grow back into adults. So now let's look at how fire impacts this life cycle. So in this study, what we found was fire tended to stimulate almost all of the processes within this life cycle. So it increased the rate of clonal reproduction. The best models, I should say, was the best model selected, showed that fire increased clonal reproduction, it increased growth rates, increased flowering, and then it also increased the number of seed capsules that were produced when the plant flowered. It did not impact the number of clones or the number of ramets or vegetatively new plants that were produced, which I observed between 1 and 7. And it reduced the survival of adults through directly killing them. And then it also, I found that in my high severity plots, I did not see very much seedling recruitment at all, so limiting seedling recruitment. Looking at a couple of these different components of the life cycle in just a little more detail, we found that plant survival declined generally with increases in fire severity, and slightly declined with the harvest experiment that we performed. So here's a graph to show survival by fire over time, and on the left, or this y-axis, it's the probability the plant survives, and then along the bottom, the x-axis, we have the size of the plant, from the smaller to the larger plant on the log scale. And so the colors, what they represent is the high severity in red, the plants in high severity conditions, the plants in low severity in orange, and then the green is unburned, plants that did not experience fire. And each dot is actually a mean value from over a size class range. So what we see is that 1 year post-fire, we can see that plants died directly from being killed by the fire, and especially with higher severity. 2 years post-fire, again, fire is influencing the mortality, but it's smaller effect and a smaller size of plants. 3 years post-fire, we had seedlings coming up because this fire was accompanied the next year where there was quite a bit of flowering at some sites. And here we see that the seedlings are the majority of the ones who are dying, and there aren't many seedlings in that burned plot. So the effect of fire changes over time, and it varies by the size class. For plant growth, we see fire severity, as I mentioned before, is stimulating that growth. Fire, of course, tends to release nutrients that plants can use. That might be one reason. Here we can see the data from along the bottom, or the X is year 1 and then year 2 on the y-axis, and here's year 2 and then year 3 on the y-axis. So this graph shows the growth of, each dot is the growth of an individual in a given year. And you can see the orange and the red lines and dots are higher than the green. So it's showing how burning has increased the growth rate for plants across this experiment. In terms of the effect of soil moisture, if you look to the bottom left here, you can see that small plants, if you compare this left graph for low moisture, when they move into a higher moisture situation, the small plants grow a lot more. But it's not true for large plants. When we go from low to high moisture, the large plants don't see any difference, or maybe even a slight decline in their growth rate. So it means that soil moisture matters, but more so for small plants than large plants who might have already access to a larger root structure and aren't as affected by changes in moisture. But it's an example of some interactions that can occur. When we take all of these factors, that was just a few examples, but if we take all components of the life cycle, we combine them into that IPM I mentioned, we can see how are the plants doing over the long term across the different conditions. Now, assuming these conditions continued into the future, 1 year post-fire, this bar here, the orange, shows the low severity plants have the highest growth rate. And lambda is the population growth rate, and the line of 1 with the dotted line is 0 growth of the population. So above this, we're growing, and below this, they're shrinking. 2 years post-fire, it's the higher severity plot's doing a little better, and 3 years post-fire, again, the low severity plot's doing better. When we look at the impacts of soil moisture, here again, this is a lambda graph, so 1 is 0 growth. As you move to the left, increasing drought, this is now a simulation of what might happen. We see that the pretty drastic decline in the growth rates of the populations over time. As we increase light, again, this is a simulation I did, we see generally an increase in the population growth rate across time and across fire severity. In terms of the impacts of harvest, based on conversations with gatherers and research, literature search, I performed one type of harvest that is intended to simulate one type of indigenous harvest. So removing a small portion of leaves per plant. And what we saw was that this increased the growth rate of the populations, particularly when you look at the proportion of plants harvested. When you go from 0% up to about 20% or 10%, you see actually an increase in the overall population growth rate. So while harvest slightly decreased survival, it actually stimulated clonal reproduction or vegetative reproduction and did not in our study affect flowering. So we see a positive impact of indigenous harvest on the plant populations. Now thinking about leaf qualities, which we measured through looking at some of the leaf traits, what I have so far to share is leaf width and length, which we measured, and the taper, as well as the LMA or leaf thickness, which could be a proxy for strength. And what we found a little bit different than some other studies, I did mixed models for these, and the best model showed that for length and width, fire was not a good predictor of length and width, holding size of plants constant. But as we looked at canopy, but with canopy openness, we tended to have shorter and wider leaves with increased canopy openness. In terms of the taper, fire and canopy didn't influence this, but we did see an increase in the variation with fire, which could be important if you're looking for different types of taper. Fire is going to increase then access to a variety of different types of leaves, which could be important for weavers. And for the leaf thickness or the proxy for strength, we didn't detect any differences. unlike some other studies. So now I'm on to my last two slides for conclusions. And overall, when we think about fire suppression, generally this has led to more high severity fires and more situations for the plants with no fire, so these latter two. What we found was the highest growth rate occurred with low severity, followed by high severity, and then no fire. And so this would suggest that fire suppression is reducing the overall growth rate of beargrass. In terms of climate change, we looked at soil moisture. Declines in soil moisture led to reductions, simulated reductions in population growth. With regard to timber harvest, we looked only at the aspect of canopy openness. Increasing canopy openness increased our population growth rates. Commercial harvest we didn't measure directly, but based on observations, knowledge of cultural practitioners, and what we've observed in this study, this would tend to likely not be sustainable and depending on the intensity. Okay, so some conclusions continued. In terms of access, this is a consistent issue that was brought up more so in some areas than others for the inability to access the plants. The need also for policy work, for education, especially for federal workers around federal trust responsibilities, Native American gathering rights, and sovereignty of tribal communities and tribal nations. So that was something that was brought up. For quality, similar to other studies, and people mentioned decline in quality in most cases with some nuance. And also there's many adaptations or resilience. So leaves, even if they aren't of the right quality, with some work can be adapted, scraped. There's even machines you can use to get the quality that you particularly want for your weaving. And in terms of Native youth engagement, programs that I worked with in the rural area and an urban area, we saw a high level of interest of students in generally their cultural traditions, but particularly with weaving. So I think with further work to have effective collaborations between federal workers, tribal members, and researchers, I think as these collaborations can be strengthened and we can develop good co-management agreements, we're going to see really there's a high potential for beargrass, biocultural relationships, and others to really be strengthened moving into the future. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Department of Botany, my advisor, Tamara Tickton, my committee members, Oru Galway, David Duffy, Mehana Vaughn, Heather McMillan, Frank Lake, and Creighton Litton. And I'd like to also thank my colleagues over the several years, my lab members and friends, family, and field assistants who have been instrumental in this work. I'd like to have a special thanks to my mother, Siri Jackman, and also to my partner, Gilbert, my husband, Gilbert Fredelucis, who have both been incredibly supportive to me, both in the field and outside of the field. I'd also like to thank funding from the Beatrice Cross Fellowship and as well as Joint Fire Sciences Graduate Research Innovation Award, as none of this would have been possible without the support of that award. So thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any questions in the time I have remaining.
Fantastic. Thank you, Georgia. That was wonderful, and the baskets made from that beargrass are just so beautiful. So like Georgia said, we'll open it up for some questions while we transition to Tony. He's going to be our next presenter. He's going to load his screen. But Georgia, I think you covered this a little bit, but we did have a question come in from someone asking, is the beargrass being harvested early? And can someone address, or can you address the harvest practices in terms of time?
Yeah. I'm not an expert in that, and I hear different things from different people in different areas. So I think the rule with a lot of this is that it depends. The right time to gather when the leaves are ready could depend on the weather, could depend on a lot of factors, but also it somewhat could depend on convenience. Is that the time you're going to gather your huckleberry or doing something else? That might be the time to go. Yeah, summer and fall harvest is common. When someone says, do they gather early? Earlier in the season, I assume that means like perhaps April, May, June. I haven't heard that from cultural practitioners. In terms of commercial harvest, that's possible. I tended to hear about and observe more in the summer and fall, but that's just my limited experience with that. So.
Great. We have a comment here. Thank you, Georgia. Great presentation. I'm wondering if there are any changes in the phenological timing of beargrass development in relation to fires, i.e. like flowers blooming later post-fire?
That's a really interesting question, yeah. So I observed, so flowering is a phenomenon in beargrass that isn't fully understood. And it sounds like this person already has quite a bit of knowledge about that process. At my site, the massed flowering, meaning when flowers are blooming in mass, like the picture on the screen here, that occurred in 2015 at 2 of my sites, but 2017 at another one of my sites. So that might be a phenomenon somewhat controlled by climate, but then fire itself is also stimulating flowering. And it looks like that stimulation of flowering occurs 1 and 2 years post-fire. I do have a slide that talks a little bit about that, but I think the flowering, what I saw in this data was that flowering was stimulated 1 and 2 years post-fire. And then 3 years post-fire, we saw that flowering was mostly controlled by the canopy openness, and that effect of the fire tended to kind of wear off. Now, do the plants flower later because of the fire? Maybe that person wants to share a little more, and then I could answer.
Sure, let's just give them a minute to think about that and respond. Let's just see here. Well, while we're waiting for that person to respond, let's just quickly take another question along the same lines. For prescribed burning of beargrass, did you find a preference between burning in the spring or fall?
In terms of prescribed burning, I think the fall is what makes the most sense. I don't have a preference of cultural practitioners to share about that, but I think the fall is what makes sense. I don't think we'd want to burn the plants before they had a chance to flower. There's some flowering every year and kind of complete their growth season. I think it would make more sense to burn in the fall, similar to the timing when you might be burning huckleberry in the subalpine. Mm-hmm. And you probably at the time when you're getting closer to the rains coming back might be a safer time too to do that.
Mm-hmm. And then I have another question here. I have a picture on my wall that shows a firefighter cutting hand line through a patch of bare grass. The fire they are trying to stop is low intensity. Are there efforts to direct fire suppression strategies that will help support native plants such as this?
I think that's really important, and it's a great direction to be moving. I know there are cultural burns. I mean, there are prescribed burns for bear grass, and I've heard more about that in Northern California and on the Olympic Peninsula than I have in Oregon. But there's more of that going on, I think, also on tribal land, so on reservations that we don't necessarily hear as much about. But that'd be a good thing, I think, to a good place to go to learn more about cultural burn or prescribed burn for these resources. But there's certainly another place to look, I think, would be Northern California, to look at the programs they have for burning for bear grass. And there's a lot of unknown specifics about the temperature you might want to burn the plants, and there's a lot of specifics there about how to burn for plants such as bear grass. So I think there's information out there that we can utilize in other regions where we want to enhance bear grass through prescribed fire.
Mm-hmm. And then what types of recommendation do you give for folks? So what types of recommendations do you or the folks you work with have in terms of strengthening partnerships between tribes, Forest Service, and researchers?
I can just speak to my experience. I think it's a really fruitful area for more really research into the best methods, into what's happening and what's not happening across those boundaries. And in my experience, I think the identity of researcher, you need to be, I think it's really important for researchers to be aware of what has happened historically, the kinds of abuses or misunderstandings that have occurred in the past, so that you can come to community with an awareness, a little more awareness as to what your identity as a researcher might feel like. And identities can be complex. You might be an Indigenous researcher, you might be a non-Indigenous researcher, you might be a Forest Service worker and a researcher, so there's a lot of complexity too. But I think it's mutual respect and collaboration comes through starting projects from the beginning together. It comes through multiple conversations and educating ourselves. I think everyone involved in that triangle. I think educating about what is tribal history, tribal sovereignty, topics we might not learn in school, but we need to learn if we're going to be successful in managing our forests moving forward, and involving, really taking a collaborative approach. So I think that's the main thing I would suggest would be moving slowly, educating yourself if you're not already educated on topics of tribal sovereignty and politics and history, and then, going with what community members want once you get to the stage of understanding that. But it's a lot of, it's not the same pace as grant cycles. It's not necessarily the most fundable and easy approach in terms of money, especially as a graduate student. So I think there's some real challenges too that need to be addressed in thinking about what can also support graduate students in that type of research.
Great. And just to follow back up with one of our first questions about phenology, the person responded and said, I do think the phenology is more climate dependent, but don't know if anyone has looked at the phenology in relation to fires of any cultural resources. Interesting, and a whole other PhD. Thank you, and always was good to work with you. So, Georgia, I'm going to pause here and give Tony a chance to talk about his project, and then we'll come back around at the end of his talk, and we'll open it up again for questions. So, Georgia, if you could go ahead and mute your line, and Tony, please go ahead whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Can folks hear me?
Sounds great.
Okay, great. And just to begin, thanks so much, Georgia. That was a really, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I'm actually really, I'm grateful that there's other PhD students and recent graduates that are really looking at these issues closely, and it's important as we move forward, as we try and make changes in terms of forest management in the Pacific Northwest. Thanks again for having me. I'm going to present data that myself and Dr. Frank Lake have worked on together, and it's been a really great opportunity to work closely with Frank, as well as the Yurok and Kuduk tribes in Northwest California. Looking particularly at hazelnut, but more generally, I think there was an interesting question that was brought up around managing wildfires, and I would just throw out there that the Kuduk tribe and the Yurok tribe both have agreements with Six Rivers and Klamath National Forests in terms of managing wildfires for some of these resources as well. I'll obviously be focusing more on prescribed fire management in this talk, but those two tribes have made a lot of headway in regard to that as well. And in particular, I think what motivated some of this research is that there's a lot of ongoing fuel management in our national forests, and how can that fuel management look at indigenous resources as well and integrate indigenous resource objectives into fuel treatments. Now, often the objective of indigenous communities is to increase cultural and subsistence resource densities. And so in some cases, these may be more compatible than some resources may be more compatible with existing fuel treatments, but existing fuel treatments might want to change to integrate some of these resource objectives, like whether it be beargrass or in this case, California hazelnut. And I really think the work that the Yurok and Karuk tribes are doing can really be models for the rest of the country and the Northwest. So where we're working, you can see Karuk and Yurok territories. This map was created by a recent formation called the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network, which is supported by the Nature Conservancy and others. And of course, the Yurok and Karuks their territories are centered around the Klamath River in Northwest California. And this area continues to be, tribal members in this area continue to be highly resource dependent, as it's a very remote area. And a large amount of the ancestral territories are now under the control of the Forest Service, as well as Redwood National Park and private timber companies. Even on the Yurok Reservation, over about 50% of the reservation is controlled by private timber companies. And there's been a long history of timber extraction in these national forests and throughout these territories. California hazelnut, as you can see, has a pretty large range and was used as a part, and it continues to be used by indigenous people throughout California and the Pacific Northwest as a part of basketry and other components of material culture. And in terms of research, we're really interested in both the ecological as well as social effects of indigenous resource management. So in this case, we have Lucy Thompson, who some have said is one of the first Native women to publish a book in the United States, talking about the ecological processes in burning hazel groves on the Yurok Reservation or in Yurok territory. We also have important social component to fire and the management of hazel, especially when it comes to fire exclusion and its effects on the social lives of indigenous people in this region. So today we still find that members of the Karuk and Yurok tribes and others are continuing to harvest hazel for various things, whether it be a baby basket like this up on the top right, which uses, for example, about 200 to 300 hazel stems and is sold for upwards of $600 for a basket. And there's a very high demand for these baskets within this region. These baskets are also used in weaving these beautiful ceremonial baskets that these young women are wearing at a ceremony. Baskets are also used in processing acorns, which continue to be an important food source in this part of California and in other parts of California as well. So this is a basic schematic of hazelnut stem harvesting, the hazelnut stem harvesting cycle, which is based both on traditional ecological knowledge of the basket weavers we collaborate with, and the actual measurements of stem lengths and diameters that we've taken. So a mature hazel that hasn't been burned for many years is tall and branchy, has large diameter stems, and after a burn, whether it be prescribed or wild, the stem diameters decrease and the stems become straight and unbranched, which are a really great basket weaving material. And once these are harvested, basket weavers, this coppicing measure will actually produce, continue to produce good quality stems, but without ongoing harvesting, and also just generally the quality and of stems decreases over time, and eventually the hazel will become a mature hazel without the production of good stems. And this is what a mature hazel looks like, that certainly doesn't produce good stems for basketry. This is a hazel shrub directly after, one growing season after a prescribed burn done on the Yurok Reservation by the Cultural Fire Management Council. And this is kind of up close, some of those good quality stems growing after a burn. And here's a basket weaver at one of the prescribed burn sites on the Yurok Reservation with good quality stems in that she's harvesting. And lastly, after stems are harvested, they're peeled, and then once they're peeled, they can be used for weaving. So what motivated a lot of this research was that for many, many years, there were insufficient levels of prescribed fire in this area. And so basket weavers were coming up with alternative methods to produce these good quality basket weaving stems. And we wanted to explore whether or not or how efficient those methods were, because some of them were also used in other fuel management treatments in the national forests of this region. So we kind of call these fire proxies. Now there has been an increase in prescribed fire in the region, and so we're also beginning to look at the effects of these broadcast burns on hazel as well. And so we're looking at primarily production, the amount of good usable stems that these treatments are producing, as well as some of the biophysical factors that affect good quality stem production, like aspect, slope, gear browse, and canopy cover. So one of the initial studies looked at a small area where we subdivided the area into blocks, where we included 3 treatments and a control in each of these blocks, which is represented by a dot on this aerial photo. These 3 treatments included cutting, cutting the shrub down to the base, applying a propane torch to a hazel shrub until the stems blistered and it was clear that the stems had been top killed, as well as doing pile burns close to a shrub as well. And this all occurred in a block. And for the broadcast fire treatments that have been occurring recently, we've basically been putting in or monitoring 10 individual shrubs in these larger plots. And so generally, this is a box plot looking at the outcome from these treatments and the broadcast burning that has been occurring recently. You can see on the lower left the control where nothing was done to these shrubs. You have very low proportions of good quality hazel stems, which again are those straight unbranched stems. And the cutting treatment has really high variability. You will get good quality stems, better than getting none at all, but it's not really clear, or you can't really predict all the time whether or not you'll get the outcome that you desire. And pile burning, propane treatments, much higher rate of success. And obviously these are using fire to produce the outcome. Pile burning we see as creating a little bit more variability compared to the propane, which is a much more direct and focused burning method. In doing an ANOVA analysis of these treatments, we see that propane burning and broadcast burning are significantly different from the cutting treatment, but again, pile burning doesn't really create a significant difference between it and the cut treatment. Using logistic regression modeling, we're also seeing that the aspect of where the shrub is growing is affecting the usable proportion of hazel stems in a particular shrub. And so eastern aspects are lower light, and as basket weavers say, you know, stems when they're reaching for light, they are often better stems and do not create as much branching, whereas stems that are in fuller light, like in a southern exposure, may create more branching. And so we're finding that this trend is bearing out in our research plots as well. Certainly deer browse, when a deer browses on a hazel shrub, it makes the stems very branchy and unusable for basket weaving. Currently, we weren't able to find a significant measure that canopy cover had a significant effect, but we're going to go back and do more thorough sampling at some of these broadcast burn sites that we're monitoring currently. Oh, and we have these game cameras up in some of our plots as well, and we see elk are also browsing on our hazel. Generally, this is just to show that the stem diameter, basket weavers want smaller stem diameters, and so after burning, you have smaller stem diameters. The green curve is the distribution post-burn. Now we're also really interested in the social effects. Do these burns increase the availability of and accessibility of these hazel stems for basket weavers? Oh, and preliminary results are showing that basket weavers really like to harvest in these areas. One, they're closer to roads than, let's say, a wildfire, and wildfires, you don't necessarily know where all the hazel is located to access it and harvest it. So it takes more time, obviously, to search for hazel in an area, in a wildfire area. But even so, we have families that travel over 75 miles to access these prescribed burn areas throughout the region. But despite this, there's a great need to increase the amount of prescribed burning, because a lot of these prescribed burns occur in traditional gathering areas for specific families. And so it's really important that tribal members throughout the territories have access to gathering locations in their families' gathering areas. So this is an ongoing project, and we continue to monitor hazel and some of the biophysical variables that affect hazel. We're also really interested in how prescribed fire is affecting the larger ecological community, and whether or not prescribed fire is creating a larger ecological system that is benefiting hazel and other species that may be underrepresented due to management focused on timber and conifer timber management. So, for example, we're looking at hardwood persistence in these prescribed fire areas. And we're going to continue to do interviews with households to see how these burns are affecting their access to these resources, as well as looking at the constraints to prescribed burning in the Klamath Mountains as a part of the GRIN grant that I received. So generally, I focus on kind of the barriers to prescribed fire management in the region in terms of creating more access and availability of hazel stem basketry. A lot of the things that I've heard thus far in interviews is there's pretty cumbersome permitting processes. There's not enough resources to get more prescribed fire on the ground. And there's a need to increase the qualifications for tribal members, especially in their wildland fire crews, so that they can conduct more prescribed burns independently. But I also want to point out that this recent paper that came out, written by Professor Dobkins and others, about cultural plant harvests on federal lands in Oregon and Washington, and they pointed out that there's these other barriers as well, physical barriers, permits, in terms of gathering permits, relationships with forest managers. A lot of these ring true also in Northwest California. There's a lot of forest managers that just cycle through a lot of these ranger stations and don't necessarily have the relationships with basket weavers and other tribal members. And trying to maintain and develop these relationships is really important, certainly in terms of reducing the obstacles to harvesting. So if you haven't seen this report, I highly recommend it. And with that, I just really want to thank the basket weavers and cultural practitioners that have supported us in doing this work, because it's their love and their just their tenacity in trying to move this forward so that they can maintain their sovereignty. That's fundamentally what is pushing this work forward. And of course, Dr. Frank Lake and other folks on my committee at Penn State and at Stanford, and certainly the funders, National Science Foundation and the Joint Fire Science Program. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tony, so much for that. We did have a couple of questions come in while you were talking, and so I'll go ahead and open up this section for questions, whether for Tony's presentation or George's presentation. We had a question come in regarding, let me see if I can get back to it. Does the fire have any effect on nut production? Hazelnuts as a food source was not mentioned. Was it not a desirable food for the area?
That's a great question. I focused only on the stems in this presentation, but we we are also studying the nut production, and it was certainly an extremely important food actually in this region. And like a milk of hazelnuts was actually given to babies regularly when they were first born, I believe. And certainly nuts were harvested throughout California and of course throughout the Pacific Northwest. And some preliminary results or observations that I've had, as well as and other observations from cultural practitioners from these tribes, is that nut production increases at about 4 to 8 years after a fire, and canopy cover really has an important role in this because the more sunlight seems like the higher amount of nut production for a given shrub. But this is one component of our study that is ongoing, and I look forward to analyzing the data and collecting more data on this question.
Fantastic. Another question came in. Does burn intensity affect the quality of the hazel branches that gatherers requires for their wares?
Yeah, that's something that is still ongoing as well. With a lot of the prescribed burns, I'm able to take just basic observations of fire behavior. I also have some sites where I'm observing hazel regrowth post-fire. Basket weavers often complain that some of the prescribed burns aren't at a high enough intensity to top kill shrubs efficiently. And so obviously there's a hesitation around prescribed burning because you don't want the fire to escape, and that can often lead to lower intensity burns when hazel shrubs need a little bit higher intensity in order to be top killed to then produce the good stems. With that said, many basket weavers harvest in wildfire areas where there's high intensity fire, lots of tree mortality and that kind of thing, and they say it's very good hazel stems in those locations.
Great. Any other questions? We just have a minute or two left in this session today. Both for Georgia and Tony, I've been getting a lot of comments that say, thank you both, such interesting information. And I agree that both of these presentations have been really interesting, and the basketry work is just so beautiful. Let's see, I think, did we get another question that came in? No, I don't see any, and while I wait just another minute, again, thanks again to Georgia and Tony for talking with us today. I also want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to listen in. We do have another question or a comment that came in. As a fire manager in Happy Camp, California, I will thank you both. And then a comment, what is the logo at the bottom right that says Cultural Fire?
Oh, yes, sure. The Cultural Fire Management Council is primarily a group of Yurok tribal members working on the Yurok reservation, and they're doing a lot of prescribed burning. And I don't know if I mentioned, but there's the training exchanges that happen each year. The Cultural Fire Management Council spearheads 2 of these training exchanges each year, and they're always looking for participants, just like the Klamath River Treks, also upriver and Kuduk territory primarily looks for participants. So if any of you all are interested in increasing your qualifications and learning more about fire, putting fire on the ground in this part of the world, then there's many ways of getting involved. Thanks.
Great. And Tony, just one last question, and then we have to end it for today. In many cases, burning increased habitat for deer and elk. Did hunting go hand in hand with hazelbrush stem production?
Yeah, that's something I'm looking at. I'm interviewing hunters, as I might have mentioned in one of my bullet points, and I still have to analyze the frequency of deer in some of these burn plots. But a lot of these areas, you know, they're some of the prescribed burn areas are fairly small, and they're often on private property. So it really depends on whether the property owners are hunters and other factors like that. So we have yet to see. Thanks.
Okay, great. So thanks again. And, you know, if you have any interesting idea for a webinar, please don't hesitate to get a hold of us. I gave our web address earlier in the session today. So that concludes our session, and thank you, and everybody have a great day. Thanks a lot, Tony. Thanks a lot, Georgia.